Good afternoon and welcome to another webinar of the America-Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation. My name is Joana Gomes-Peirão and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we begin, just a few words about the chair. The America-Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation is an interdisciplinary initiative of the America-Europe Fund, which aims to bring together expertise at KU Leuven in order to track, examine, and compare regulatory developments relating to technology and innovation in America and in Europe. And on top of that, the chair also promotes opportunities for cooperation and learning between policymakers, business communities, civil society actors, and knowledge institutes. So today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Laura Kreiling, Dr. Sana Zakaria, and Ms. Nora Hertz for an interesting discussion on the opportunities and challenges posed by emerging neurotechnologies, as well as the OECD recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology and the need for so-called Neurorights. Our first speaker, Dr. Sana Zakaria, is a research leader at the think tank RAND Europe, where she leads research on biotechnology policy, focusing on synthetic biology, advances in machine learning and genome editing, as well as food systems and brain-computer interfacing. And Sana also holds a PhD in developmental neurobiology. Dr. Laura Kreiling, our second speaker, is a policy analyst at the OECD in the Working Party on Bio, Nano, and Converging Technologies. And she has worked on collaborative platforms for converging technologies, emerging technology governance, and the monitoring and implementation of the OECD recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And Ms. Nora Hertz, our third speaker, is a PhD candidate at the University of Freiburg in Germany and a researcher for the Rescale project, which stands for Responsible and Scalable Learning for Robots Assisting Humans. Our research focuses on human rights, neurotechnologies, artificial intelligence, technology regulation, and values in design. So thank you very much for our three speakers for joining us today. I will give the floor first to Sana, who will present the scientific landscape, what are new technologies, what opportunities they present, and what concerns they raise for our society. Then I'll give the floor to Laura, who will present the OECD's work on addressing the concerns raised by neurotechnologies. And finally, Nora will reflect on the human rights concerns associated with the development of these technologies and the need for neurorights. And after the presentations, we'll have a discussion and Q&A. So now I'd like to thank our speakers and our audience for joining us today and give the floor to you, Sana.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, and I presume you can see my screen. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Great, thank you so much for inviting me to present on this very exciting topic. So as Joanna said, I'm a research leader at RAND Europe. So we're a non-partisan policy research organization, and we work across science and technology, defense, criminal justice, and health. My personal areas of experience and interest are R&D, ecosystem funding, and governance and regulation, and application and global governance of emerging biotechnologies as well. And I'm very happy to be talking about neurotechnologies today. So I guess the first thing a good place to start is to really talk about what we mean by neurotechnologies. So there are quite a few definitions of neurotechnologies across different sectors. So from academia, it's been described as the assembly of methods and instruments that enable a direct connection of technical components with the nervous system. Or from private corporate sector, people have described it as encompassing all technologies developed to understand the brain, visualize its processes, control, repair, improve function, and so on and so forth. But what it really boils down to is that it's a technology that facilitates a connection with the brain for either data capture and or manipulation. So in terms of the landscape of neurotechnologies, it's broadly categorized into whether it is invasive or non-invasive. So the invasive technology is primarily used in a medical setting. So for example, using implanted electrodes or chips or devices in various parts of the brain. So you could have an implanted electrode in the motor cortex for complex signals and interactions to control prosthetic limbs, for instance, or you could have it a diagnostic use for it by placing it under the cranial bone to study brainwave patterns in epilepsy, for instance. Then you have non-invasive technology that's found in multiple settings. So it's used in non-medical settings like the gaming, immersive gaming market research, lifestyle behavior, as well as medical settings as well. And that's sort of primarily used via electrodes or chips or devices on the skin rather than being implanted inside the brain. And these sort of include things like electrode caps used in speech through computers for ALS patients, for instance, or EEG, which has been around for a long time as a medical screening procedure. And the interesting thing to note here is that for both invasive and non-invasive technologies, there are two types of functions. So there's a recording or a readout function where really it's about capturing data, which is a one-way capture, or you can have a stimulating or a modulating function. So some examples, so what do we mean by? So some examples, for example, for invasive technology, there's recording technology known as ECOG. So that's intracranial electroencephalography. And that's basically you have electrodes placed in the brain, but that's really for the purpose of recording and capturing data. But then you have modulating technology, so deep brain stimulation. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it before. There's been a lot of ongoing reports around deep brain stimulation in the context of Parkinson's recently, for instance. Then there's optogenetics-based stimulation as well. Now, they use different mechanisms of action, but effectively it's an implanted device in the brain that is for the purpose of changing something or modulating or stimulating a part of the brain. Then you have the non-invasive recording technologies, which are like your EEG, like I mentioned. This has been around for a while, or an MRI. Most of you might be familiar with it. These are used in medical settings. And that's, again, for the purpose of capturing data. And you have MEG as well, for instance, which is magnetoencephalography. And then you have the more non-invasive modulating technology, which is a really interesting space. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Within that, you have ECT, which is the electroconvulsive therapy. Again, that's been around for a while as well, but that's done via placing electrodes on the skin. You have transcranial magnetic stimulation and pulsed electromagnetic field. These are a few of many other forms of modulating technologies that exist. And this is just to give you a flavor of the type of technological or scientific underpinnings of the kind of things that we are seeing and hearing about now. And again, just to make it a bit more real, here are some applications across multiple fronts. So for example, you have companies producing EEG headsets just for the purpose of detecting biomarkers for neurodegenerative disease, for instance. And so again, this is a recording or a capturing device, which is non-invasive. Similarly, you have another capturing or non-invasive device for functional neuroimaging, or then you have from Flow Neuroscience a headset that can stimulate the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain, for at-home treatment for depression. So this is non-invasive, but it's stimulating. It's not just for recording. It's something that can be used at home. Headphones that are using electromagnetic, pulse electromagnetic technology to promote relaxation, meditation, sleep. You have then electrodes that can be inserted. So this is an example of an invasive device that can detect epileptic seizures. And then something that's been around quite a lot recently in the media is this miniaturized deep brain stimulation chip for alleviating symptoms of Parkinson's disease, for instance, which has been showing great promise in trials. Now, as you can imagine, a variety of opportunities have been unlocked by technological advancements such as these. So we've got things like improved diagnosis and prognosis of disease. You can read emotions, you can regulate emotions. There's been an integration of human and machine to a degree not seen before. There's new fields and sectors that have opened up, such as immersive marketing or immersive gaming as well. And then quite interestingly, there's also a cross-section of technologies emerging with neurotechnology, such as neurotechnology and the metaverse, or neurotechnology underpinned by machine learning algorithms, which is also very, very interesting, but also very complex landscape to navigate. Now, neurotechnology and brain-computer interfacing devices have been around for a long time. This is not something that was discovered a few years ago. However, activity in this space has really exploded somewhat. And this can be seen in reviewing, for instance, the patent activity related to brain-computer interfacing in the last 8 years. If you see the patterns of patents filed over the last 8 years, there's been a 4-fold increase. And then relative increase in the patents that are active and granted as well over the same period of time. And then if you look at the table on the left, so the top 10 countries with the most currently active patents it starts with the US, and that's by far exceeds all the other countries in the table collectively put together as well. Which is in stark contrast to the rest of the countries. However, quite a few countries active in this space, and the UK makes it into the top 10 as well as South Korea, China, Germany. So quite a range of countries involved in activity in this space, but US by far exceeding the rest in terms of commercial activity. And here on the right is just an interesting infographic, which I really liked, which I thought just again exemplifies the kind of development trends that are emerging, where this is one of a company's sort of goal and ambitions outlined around neurotechnologies, where they have the ability to stimulate parts of the brain and restore memories that were thought previously lost, but then they want to be able to basically enhance or rewrite damaged memories, and then come up with a commercial implant for memory stimulation by 2030s. You can imagine the kind of utility of something like that in terms of being able to improve and enhance memory. And then later on by 2040s, actually manipulating memories and removing unhappy ones. And, you know, what does that mean for a person and for society? Quite a lot of interesting questions there. Again, similarly, another projection in terms of trends and of the technology itself, in terms of the devices that are being utilized, the idea is that they will become smaller, efficient, multiple channels of interfacing will be utilized. So that's kind of the future of brain-computer interfacing, where you have devices, non-invasive, with higher fidelity, that will be on par with devices that are implanted perhaps, and they could maybe even be injected or inhaled rather than being implanted into the brain via a surgical procedure. So that's kind of like the future. So it becomes kind of more and more easier and more accessible in the way of technological advancements itself. And so today, you know, we can use a simple wearable device, for instance. We can get graphical, real-time display of brain activity, what people would equate to being able to see emotions and mental states of individuals, for instance. Now, all of these things that I've mentioned really lead up to talking about this, that you know, the challenges that exist in this space. So the opportunities that are unlocked are fantastic, but there are also very complex challenges that are here that need to be navigated. And some of these challenges are the top with the infinity sign. These are challenges that have existed for a long time. They are not necessarily unique to neurotechnologies, but then neurotechnology itself opens up much more, I guess, novel challenges that we haven't grappled with before. So I'll take a bit more time to talk through the novel challenges. So the challenges that have existed and are also commonly found in other spaces are things like, you know, access to technologies, equity, informed consent, safety, sort of, you know, gaps in safety. Anytime there's new technological development, further research is needed. You need to kind of go through the whole trial process to make sure it's safe. And it does what it says on the tin. So these are big challenges to navigate, no doubt. But then within that, there's also lots of new challenges that have emerged. So these are things like complex neurodata, neuroprivacy considerations, because neuroimaging data can reveal really sensitive information about an individual's thought process, emotions, their mental health, And that raises really complex privacy concerns. There's also a lack of standards at this point in time for this kind of data sharing and its analysis, which really limits the reproducibility of the underpinning research. And these are challenges that could manifest in forms where employers could use brain data to assess productivity or mental health. It could create incentives for punitive measures, for instance. And there already is a trial taking place. It's using something called smart cap technology in the US in an employer-employee setting. Then there's ethical concerns around cognitive enhancements. If you start in doing cognitive enhancement and behavioral changes as a result of this use, this raises questions around fairness and safety and autonomy, because it creates challenges where in scenarios the person may behave in a way where their actions may no longer be attributable to them anymore. You have then, I mentioned this before, the fusion and the integration of human beings and machine. So here we have instances where effectively silicon is being placed into the brain, and some people have equated it to a new form of mechanization of the self. And really it opens up or paves the way for a new kind of shared decision making, almost gives a new meaning to the word shared decision making in a way that hasn't been seen before. But it also opens up the opportunity for people to hack a person, which has not been possible in the way before this technology existed. And then there's the interdisciplinary nature. So neurotechnologies, not unlike many of the technologies that are emerging, are really, really interdisciplinary. So this involves fields like neuroscience, computer science, engineering. And really this represents a challenging space for regulators, because multi-sectoral regulation is perhaps required in this space for it to be effective. My last slide really is a quote that I really like, which feels more true now than it has ever been before, by a famous brain surgeon in the US, where he calls brain the organ of destiny, and says that holds within its humming mechanism secrets that will determine the future of the human race, which I thought was really exciting, inspiring, and scary in equal measures. So with that, I will stop talking now and hand over to Joanna and my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Sanna. You touched on many interesting topics, and I'm sure that Laura and Nora will also touch upon. Before I give the floor to Laura, I would just like to let our audience know that they can ask questions using the Q&A tool, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. And we will go through these questions at the end of the webinar, so after the presentation. Now I'd like to thank Laura for joining us and give her the floor.
Thanks so much, Joanna. I see that Sanna is still sharing her screen.
Sanna, are you able to stop sharing?
I will give it a shot. I can't seem to see the place where I would do that. My controls seem to have disappeared for some reason.
You can try to hit escape. Can you try to hit escape? Because my screen sharing is disabled. It says disabled because another participant is sharing screen.
Okay, hang on. Let's see if that's
okay. Now it works.
Okay.
Right. Now my Zoom window disappeared. Here we go.
Okay, now we can see your screen as well.
Thank you for bearing with me. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in today's exciting webinar. My name is Laura Kreining. I come from the OECD. I'm policy analyst in the Division of Science Technology Policy. I'll be speaking today about the OECD's work on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. I'll start very broad by situating where this work is located at OECD. and I'll then give you more detailed information on the OECD recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology, which I assume you all are familiar with, or you might have heard about it. And I hope that after my talk today, you are feeling more informed about what this recommendation is about, what the OECD and its member countries hope to achieve with it, and what the efforts and events and measures are that we've been taking so far in implementing this recommendation. So the work on the recommendation is situated in a working party, which is working around bio, nano, and converging technologies. It's abbreviated as BNCT. I'm policy analyst together with Dave Winnikov and in a larger team who is working on various issues around global bioeconomy, for example, technology convergence, digitalization. And so the policy issues that we are discussing as part of this working party, and where we regularly convene with members and OECD delegations, are related to around research and development questions, about innovation and commercialization of technologies. Also, we talk about the standards and regulation, ethical, legal, and social issues, and public engagement. We touch upon questions around education and skills. Measurement and evaluation is part of our work. And then all of this revolves around global challenges in responsible innovation. And back in 2014 or 2015, this working party started to work on developing this recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology, which was finally adopted in 2019 by the OECD Council. So overall challenges and goals for innovation are so-called governance challenges that BNCT has been looking at, which revolve around the pacing problem, which means that there are rapidly evolving technologies which might have very unclear impacts, that they might be quite disruptive to the economy and to the society, that there might be misfits regarding existing legal categories, and also in terms of establishing larger areas of work. So in this context of these broader governance challenges, as part of our work at BNCT, we've been looking at those revolving around neurotechnologies. And on that, on this slide here, I've summarized two recent publications. On the left-hand side, that's focused on brain-computer interfaces, and as Sana outlined in the introductory presentation. So in this work here, the brain-computer interface is one area in the neurotechnology field. And my colleagues looked in a working paper on the governance system around this specific form of neurotechnology. This was a background paper for another OECD recommendation, which was about agile regulatory governance to harness innovation, that was adopted by OECD in 2021. And it looks at responsible and anticipatory governance approaches to promote innovation in the specific neurotechnology field. On the right-hand side, you see a reference to a chapter in an OECD flagship publication. It's called STI Outlook. It doesn't look specifically at neurotechnology, but I think it might still be interesting and relevant for some of you here today, because it looks at emerging technology governance and towards establishing an anticipatory framework. And what we mean with that, we look at in the chapter at upstream design criteria and tools. So design criteria like anticipation, inclusivity, and adaptivity. And then in the chapter, we're discussing a set of policy tools like forward-looking technology assessment, upstream societal engagement, and the co-development of soft law. And you find many examples in this publication that came out in March 2023, sorry, just a bit over a month ago. And about, for example, the co-development of soft law that's highly relevant in the context of the development of OECD recommendations. Now, here you see an example of these pieces of so-called soft law OECD recommendations. I think three are particularly relevant for the conversation that we have here today. The first one is the recommendation on responsible innovation neurotechnology that this BNCT working party has been developing and is now in charge of implementing. which I'll primarily focus on today. There is also a so-called sister recommendation, which is the one on artificial intelligence. Both were adopted by the OECD Council in 2019. There is a full-fledged OECD AI Observatory, which I can highly recommend for everyone here today to have a look at if they're interested in the latest AI developments. It is accessible at oecd.ai. And then the recommendation I just mentioned briefly, which is on agile regulatory governance to harness innovation, where my colleagues had produced this piece on BCI, I think, a bit over a year ago. So these are three recommendations from OECD that I think are particularly important around the conversation around responsible innovation. So for all of you who are unfamiliar about what an OECD recommendation is, it is an internationally agreed set of policy recommendations and principles and a set of best practices. It is so-called soft law, which means that it's not legally binding, but it means it is a political commitment by all OECD adherents or recommendation adherents, which are OECD member countries, but which can also be non-OECD member countries. The expectation is that these adherents will do their utmost to implement the recommendation. And it is also, there's a mechanism at OECD that ensures that there are regular reviews about the status of implementation of these recommendations. The idea is also that the recommendation has elements of peer learning and exchanges of best practices for adherents. So for the time of OECD recommendations being in place, the OECD Secretariat is encouraged to convene events around for adherents to bring together subject matter experts and country experiences and to exchange on how the relevance of the recommendation is. And I'll give you some examples in the context of this specific recommendation as part of this presentation today. So they're not just these three recommendations as outlined to you, but they are in fact today 177 that are currently in force. You all find them in the OECD /legal, and then they have all different numbers, as you can see on this slide here. So they are in very broad areas, as you just saw, around AI, water, neurotechnology, many areas, as you know, OECD is active in. And in this next part of the presentation, I'll give you a bit of background, now zooming in on the neurotechnology recommendation on its development journey. I personally was not part of this journey. I joined OECD right at the adoption of this recommendation, but from the colleagues who have convened this process, they've been telling me about the exciting journey that this recommendation has taken. It started in officially in September 2017, where they convened an event at the US National Academies, when they started with an expert consultation around the role of neurotechnology in society, where the first ideas around the development of this recommendation were born. Then there was in September 2019 a workshop that took place in Shanghai, where they started to convene a very broad stakeholder groups from the private sector, academia, public sector to discuss more concretely what are important elements of this recommendation. And then there was an event in 2019 at the Collège de France, where these first drafts of the recommendation, or I think the advanced drafts, were discussed. And then finally in December 2019, the recommendation was adopted. And of course, there was a breadth of analytical work which was developed around leading up to the adoption of this recommendation. Some examples you see on this slide here. Now, next part of this presentation, I'll take you through what this recommendation consists of. It is first of all, important point is that it's the first international standard on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. It sets out to guide governments and innovators to anticipate and address the ethical, legal, and social challenges raised by novel health-related neurotechnologies while promoting innovation in the field. Actually, an important word that I should have highlighted in bold here is the fact that it's about health-related neurotechnologies. So we heard from Sana, who distinguished between different forms of neurotechnology in the field. And so the OECD recommendation explicitly focuses on health-related neurotechnologies. It seeks to provide guidance to each step of the innovation process. So it looks at the research side, the tech transfer side, the investment side, the commercialization of it, and the regulation. So that benefits are maximized and risks minimized. So here you see an overview of the 9 principles that are embodying the recommendations. So when we speak of recommendation, we mean a set of 9 principles. Some of them are quite broad, promoting responsible innovation in neurotechnology to address health challenges. Others are quite specific or focusing on, for example, number 4, scientific collaboration in neurotechnology. But it also looks at inclusivity aspects like the need for societal deliberation in neurotechnology, safeguarding personal data, again, referring back to Sana that we just heard, data issues are quite an important point to address and to discuss. So there's an explicit reference to responsible practices around safeguarding personal data. But also when we think about collaboration with public and private sector actors, number 8 is about promoting cultures of stewardship and trust in neurotechnology across both sectors. And of course, anticipating and monitoring potential unintended uses or misuse of neurotechnology. So I'll zoom in as to give you a better idea that these 9 principles are broad statements that then more explicitly have certain sub-elements that define how actors should be behaving. So in the first principle, we see where it says promoting responsible innovation in neurotechnology. I mean, what does that mean? So relevant, it specifies then in the text that relevant actors should first and foremost promote beneficial applications of neurotechnology for health and foster research and development to further this aim, to avoid harm, and to show due regard for human rights and societal values, especially privacy, cognitive liberty, and autonomy of individuals. So here you see that in this sub-principle, you actually see that the development of the recommendation is fundamentally based on regarding in of respect of human rights. And then in the sub-principle E, for example, it states preventing neurotechnology innovation that seeks to affect freedom and self-determination, particularly whether this would foster or exacerbate bias or discrimination or exclusion. Another example is principle 3. This is about promoting inclusivity of neurotechnology for health. And to achieve that, actors should strive to ensure neurotechnology is both developed for and available to those in need, promote and enable policy environments that advances the inclusion of underrepresented populations, and take into account the diversity of cultures, strive to minimize inequalities with respect to inter alia, social economy, cultural norms, and the development and use of neurotechnology. So you can read the recommendations by looking by principle. There's also another way to look at it, thematic. And one of the analysis that we've done, for example, and that points out that and emphasizes that this recommendation fosters an upstream and process-based approach is when we read across. And here on this slide, we highlighted the sub-principles 1C, 1B, 4A, and overall 4. And it shows that the recommendation is set up and geared to look at upstream mechanisms, for example, by stating that actors should foster alignment for public support and economic incentives, to integrate ethical considerations and take into account public values and concerns at the planning stage and design phase of technological development, promoting interdisciplinary research and development with communities of scientists and engineers, and to support an international culture of open science. For example, creating joint infrastructures. So this is an example of reading across the 9 principles for messages that sit within those sub-principles. So I'll now that I explained to you what this recommendation is, it was adopted in December 2019, I'll give you a few examples of when we moved from this development phase after the adoption into the implementation stage, which is the one that we are currently at. And this was when I took over the the lead with David Vinikoff on this project, together with a dedicated steering group from the BNCT Working Party. And we designed a set of events and workshops to, on the one hand, disseminate the information about the existence of this recommendation, and on the other hand, engage in dialogues with stakeholders, bring the adherents in contact with respective national experts, and build overall with the aim to build capacity to implement this recommendation. The first event that was organized was in December 2020. It was in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was called the Seoul event. It was hosted virtually. As you can imagine, we had a very broad participation from 14 countries and 47 different institutions. We started to gather ideas around the implementation strategy for the recommendation, and started to exchange on national implementation experience and practices at that stage. And also the idea was proposed to build a dedicated resource around to help the implementation of this recommendation. The triangle that you see on the slide here tried to summarize the discussions that were held at the event in terms of the convergence of neurotechnologies with other emerging technologies. That was a point that Sana also alluded to in her presentation, which is a very, very important point to raise in the neurotech context. That there are these ethical, legal, and social concerns on the use of brain data, also a point that I just heard in Sana's presentation, and that there was a very strong desire, we heard from many actors, around this interdisciplinary collaboration. Then in May 2021, where there was what we called the Zurich event, it was also still in the midst of COVID, so it took place virtually. We again had a very broad participation base from this time 25 countries. And in the Zurich event, though, we zoomed in on two specific principles. So while in Seoul in September 21, we talked about it, the recommendation as a whole, we zoomed in on the societal deliberation principle 5 and the promotion and stewardship of the collaboration between public and private sector actors in principle 8. So I thought this was a really an event where we, by zooming in on those two principles, we took away really a breadth of very, very interesting insights that have been informing our work going forward, and that gave us ideas in terms of the next steps. There's an event page that I'll point you to later. Because there then in September 21 at a big OECD conference that was dedicated to, in general, about technology in and for society, there was a panel about harnessing responsible neurotechnology for brain health. In the conference report, I've pulled a couple of key points that I wanted to highlight here today, which were discussed at this panel. Panelists pointed to a range of governance problems in neurotechnology, which was around the commodification of brain data, the convergence of AI with neurotechnology, consumer neurotech regulatory lags, and also something that Sana mentioned in her introductory talk, and the private sector and the need for private sector incentives to implement governance or ethics guidelines. This is a point that we have actually picked up in another event that I'll talk to you in, I think, 2 slides. In terms of policy interventions needed to address these challenges, one was to focus on the R&D system, filling gaps, for example, by creating inclusive platforms, subscription models to promote access and investment. Another point that was that the panelists discussed was around finding the right mix between regulatory and self-regulatory modes of governance, and also to leverage human rights frameworks, which I think is also a point that that we will talk about more today. Now, in right before this big conference, I think the slide in chronological order should have been before the one I just talked about. Also an event I think that is relevant for today's discussion, which I would like to point you to, in particularly the report and the executive summary, which were produced at the back of it, which was a joint event or roundtable, in fact, between the Council of Europe and OECD, which was held in November 21 around the question of neurotechnologies and human rights frameworks. Do we need new rights? So an event where I would like to point you to these reports that were produced on the event page. I don't have time to go into all of it today, I'm afraid, and I would like to keep it to the work on the OECD recommendation specifically. On that, in fact, there's been and this is the last event I'll talk about today, which is the workshop in July last year, where we convened a group of policymakers and private sector actors around neuroethics implementation in the private sector. So this specific event picked up the point from this December conference that I just talked about, which was about the necessity in order to implement ethics guidelines, to build tools that allow and that facilitate for private sector actors to do so. This was a fairly small group compared to the previous events that we convened, and focused on entrepreneurs, students, philanthropists, investors. We talked about several ethical, legal and social issues that you see here on the slide, various challenges around the implementation of neurotechnology innovation in the private sector, and the need for these tools and mechanisms to be in a way that they are usable to private sector actors. Now, this is my, I think, almost last slide. It sort of tries to portray to you that these implementation efforts are ongoing. There are a couple of next steps that are currently underway. The first is the development of guidance resources for recommendation stakeholders. So over the past years of being in this implementation phase, we've identified that there are a range of different recommendation stakeholders. It's a recommendation that's not only targeted at policymakers, but also at academia, at research scientists, and also researchers or industry on the industry side. So there are three major stakeholder groups that we've identified in the private sector, academia, and in the public sector. And so far we have a set of draft substance tool practices and examples that we've gathered for these three groups, and we are currently in the process of designing them and co-developing them with these three groups. The second point is about national capacity building. So this is about ensuring that each adherent of the recommendation has a network of national experts in place, and then a central contact point that coordinates these experts and it reports back on the implementation of the recommendation, which is an official, as I said before, mechanism as part of OECD recommendations. Then an ongoing project that we have looks at upstream governance mechanisms in the neurotechnology field, looking at the fit for purpose of different forms of, for example, adaptive governance mechanisms. And we're looking to explore that more in the neurotechnology field. And this in the monitoring of the recommendation, the formal requirement after 5 years of its implementation. So I'll stop here. This is an overview slide that points you essentially to what we call a central hub, which is oe.cd/neurotechnology recommendation. And on this website, you find more information on the recommendation itself, the official legal text, and also the different event pages and event information that I tried to summarize in this presentation today. With that, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with you all.
Well, thank you, Laura, for this very clear and informative presentation. I'm also eager to hear Nora's thoughts on human rights and neurotechnologies. So without further ado, you have the floor, Nora.
Thank you very much. So, yes. One second. So.
We are seeing your screen now.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you very much for the kind invitation. I want to discuss today with you some questions I'm doing research on in my PhD. Namely, the question, is it time for neurorights? So do we need new human rights to protect the human mind? In my presentation, I will focus on the right to freedom of thought. Let me briefly present the structure of my presentation after an introduction, in which I will outline the human rights concern associated with neurotech. I present the proposals for new human rights, so for neurorights, before I turn to my main question, which is, what human rights gaps exist. So do existing human rights provide adequate protection, or do we need new human rights? To examine these questions, I will focus on the human right to freedom of thought as an example, and I will also provide some general consideration on how gaps in human rights protection, potential gaps can be addressed, and what kind of risks and disadvantages are associated with the introduction of new human rights. I will then conclude with an outlook. As we have already learned in the previous presentations, there's rapid progress in the development and in the use of neurotechnologies. Here, for example, we have already seen many technologies is a EEG cap for measure brain activity in clinical settings, but there are more sophisticated devices being developed, as we can see here, for example, or here. And these technologies are not only intended to be used in the medical context, as Sana outlined already for us. There are a variety of possible applications of neurotechnologies here, for example, in medicines, but also maybe in education, school. This is an example of trials of neurotechnologies in Chinese primary schools, or also for driving, for example. So the question arises as to which human rights concerns emerge and when we look at all these possible applications. And I identify four main challenges or four main human rights concerns, which are the harm of the user, unauthorized influences or manipulation, data protection, privacy issues, and discrimination and bias. When we look at the harm of the user, for example, these can result from technical defects or incorrect use. And the same is, can be said for influences. But when we look at manipulations, we have also looked at cyber attacks, for example. Data protection is, of course, one important issue because brain data is personal data, maybe sensitive data. So it might need special protection. Discrimination and bias, there are two situations. First, there can be discrimination when using a device because there's a bias in the design and in the way the device is functioning, or there can be discrimination against one because of one's mental activity. When we look at these human rights concerns, several human rights come into mind. For example, the right to physical integrity, privacy, mental integrity, identity, freedom of thought, human dignity, freedom of opinion, and non-discrimination. So we can see we have established rights that could be applicable regarding neurotechnologies. However, some argue that these rights are not sufficient. They do not provide for an adequate protection, and therefore we need new human rights. Chile is in fact the first country that has introduced a right to mental integrity in its constitution in Article 19, which have been amended. And it wants also to introduce specific neuroprotection laws. There are different proposals for neurorights, and the conceptualizations vary severely among authors. Here I want to present briefly the proposal of Ienka and Andorno from 2017, which received much attention. And the authors proposed for new human rights, the right to mental privacy that should protect brain data, the right to mental integrity, which should protect against unauthorized interferences, the right to psychological continuity, which protects the identity, and finally, the right to mental self-determination or cognitive liberty, which on the one side protects also against intrusions, and on the other hand, it should strengthen the self-determination of the person over its mental development. As said before, other authors advocate for the introduction of only one new human right, especially the right to cognitive liberty, but all these four rights are in discussion. So when we look back at the human rights that we have, then the question arises, do these rights really do not provide for an adequate protection? And in order to evaluate the necessity of introducing new human rights, the first step is to define the scope of protection of existing human rights. And I want to use the right to freedom of thought as an example to illustrate the difficulties and complexities of defining the scope of protection of existing human rights. The right to freedom of thought is codified, for example, in Article 18 ICCPR and reads, "Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion." It is also codified in Article 9 ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a regional human rights instrument, and it reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion." So in the context of the ICCPR, of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, no derogation from Article 18 is possible in public emergency. And also in the case law of the ECHR, of the European Court of Human Rights, it has been stressed that the right to freedom of thought is a basic requirement for a functioning democracy. Furthermore, the right to freedom of thought, interferences into the right to freedom of thought cannot be justified. So it is an absolute right. All the stress that this right is very important. In contrast to that stands that has been very insignificant in the case law so far. The scope of protection of this right is very unclear, and especially the definition of thought. I want to look a little bit deeper now on this question. So what are thoughts? Basically, there are two ways of interpreting the term thought. On the one hand, thought could be defined narrowly. And one could argue that thoughts, the right to freedom of thought, is codified in the same article as freedom of conscience and religion, and thoughts must therefore have a certain quality or complexity. A thought would thus be the product of a thought process leading to certain attitudes, ideas, and views which are not religious, but significant to the way of life of the individual, for example, political or philosophical thought. This means that not every mental process and not every brain data would be protected by the right to freedom of thought, but there's a certain threshold, and there might be insufficient protection for all these mental processes and brain data that do not reach this threshold. Therefore, the introduction of a new human right might be necessary in this regard. On the other hand, thought could be interpreted rather broadly, encompassing all mental processes. An argument for a broad interpretation can be found in the case law of the ECHR, for example, in the European Court of Human Rights, which has stated in a judgment that considering the comprehensiveness of the concept of thought, the parent's wish for their child's name can be deemed as a thought. So we have a very basic thought, just how the child should be named, and this was considered to be protected by the right to freedom of thought. Furthermore, the Human Rights Committee states in a general comment on Article 18 ICCPR that thoughts on all matters are protected. The right is also in this context not limited to specific thoughts, for example, political. Furthermore, the question arises to what extent the definition of thought as a result of a thought process is scientifically convincing. So can really a distinction between thought and thought process be made? And one could argue that any influence on brain activity, no matter how trivial, potentially influences the outcome of a thought process and should therefore be protected by the right to freedom of thought. Thought would thus encompass any mental process, and when we take such a broad interpretation, all mental states would enjoy protection, and these rights would provide wide-ranging protection, and the introduction of a new right does not seem necessary in this regard. So there are valid arguments for a broad interpretation for the term thought. However, there's no clarity due to the few number of cases and lack of conceptualizations in the literature. This very brief analysis demonstrate the difficulty in determining the level of protection of existing rights, and highlights also the complexity in looking on one concrete neuro right and one human rights specifically. Especially the relation of the right to freedom of thought with other human rights needs further clarification. In particular, the human right to privacy and private life, which protects privacy, integrity, and identity. In this light, it is worthwhile to raise some general considerations on how to address the gaps or uncertainties in the current human rights regime. And I want to look first on the methods of evolving the interpretation of human rights over time. The European Court of Human Rights, for example, has confirmed several times that the European Convention on Human Rights is a living instrument, meaning that its interpretation need to be adapted to changing social and technological circumstances. And also Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, which is important to interpret human rights treaties, states that the treaty must be interpreted in light of the object and purpose of the treaty. This means for human rights treaties, for which the purpose is effective protection, that an interpretation might change over time to ensure this effective protection. And an evolving interpretation can be driven not only by case law, but also by adapting new legal documents, especially soft law documents, such as recommendations of the OECD or other bodies. And the advantage of this approach, so in comparison of introducing new human rights in a new treaty or in a new protocol to a treaty, are that negotiations of soft law are often easier, because they're not legally binding and faster. And one has to keep in mind that negotiations can always be misused also to weaken human rights. Another main argument against the introduction of new human rights often is the risk of rights inflation, which means that which implies that not everything that is morally desirable should be recognized as human rights, because too many human rights can imply a certain devaluation of human rights and make compliance and enforcement difficult. On the other hand, the expansionism of human rights is also criticized, so that human rights must not give a content they didn't have originally. The state consent must be respected. So we are a little bit between these both positions. Another point that is often seen as an advantage of new human rights is that they, for example, the introduction of a new human right to mental self-determination or mental privacy can provide for more legal clarity, and it is more holistic than interpreting existing human rights. However, I think that this argument is often not convincing, because new human rights also imply many questions on how they should be interpreted, what they mean, and especially with regard to neurorights, many questions remain open regarding their conceptualizations. So to summarize, there is an uncertainty regarding the level of protection of existing human rights. It is difficult to evaluate at this time whether existing human rights provide adequate protection because of the lack of case law and discussion in literature. I would argue that introducing new human rights would not necessarily lead to a higher level of protection or more legal clarity, and it is therefore generally not more advantageous to introduce human rights than first to try to interpret and clarify the meaning of existing human rights. Perhaps what can be said above all is that neurorights, this question on neurorights, stipulate the necessary discussion on the extent to which the existing human right provides sufficient protection of the mind. And further research is needed on the interpretation of human rights, and also maybe on the conceptualizations of neurorights. Yeah, and there are several initiatives. We have already heard about the OECD, but also recently the UNESCO and the Human Rights Council that emphasize the urgency of this upcoming challenge, and this may stipulate more research and political initiatives. So finally, we can ensure that the development and use of neurotechnology comply with human rights. And with this, I want to thank you. I would like to conclude. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nora. I am conscious of time, so perhaps I'll go straight to the questions posed by our participants, since we do have a few. And the first question, I believe, is mainly for Sana and Nora. And one of our participants asks about the ethical concerns of neurotechnology when it comes to treating or managing mental illness and mental disability, specifically about the cases where a patient is not capable of fully understanding what choices are best for him. How do we ensure informed consent in these cases, if that is even possible?
I can come in quickly from a, I guess, more of a medical scientific perspective, in that, I think an important thing to keep sight of is that some of these challenges have existed in other spaces, and we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. So for instance, there are quite a few conditions where the patient is declared to be unfit to make decisions. And in that case, there are parameters and processes set out where either family members or medical professionals will make decisions on their behalf. We see that quite a lot around end-of-life care support, for instance, where patients are put on that pathway as well. So I think there are things that can be done borrowing from those areas where we don't necessarily need to create a new set of rules and parameters. That would be kind of my answer in terms of where, especially you're dealing with people who are perhaps not able to make decisions, or not able to sort of, conscious in the way that you would medically term them fit to make those decisions.
Nora, do you agree, or do you think that there are new issues here with regards to BCI, or is this sort of just business as usual in managing informed consents as is normally done in medical fields?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think that we have, for informed consent, we have already a good basis. So we have already in law a good foundation to build on. And I think it then depends on the specific situation. It might be that there are situations where the current understanding of informed consent need to be adapted. So, for example, we maybe need to draw red lines where you cannot consent, for example. So I think, yeah.
And just to quickly add, my interpretation of the question was in a situation where somebody, for instance, is seeking medical treatment, but that completely changes if you're talking about, for instance, somebody with a particular condition who might be beneficial for them to be enrolled into a trial for the purpose of research, where they're not able to provide consent, for instance, and that it is quite a complex situation but they may not necessarily benefit from it, but it would be beneficial from a research viewpoint and from a humanitarian viewpoint and population health viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. And we also have another question on data protection legislation, and perhaps I'll start with Laura if you'd like to comment on this. Is data protection legislation like the GDPR, can it be adapted or used as is for the protection of brain data of individual, or do we need something else, something specific for neurotechnologies?
Would you like for me to come in?
If you wish, yes.
Well, I can comment from the perspective of the OECD recommendations, where we have a principle that is focused on the protection of brain data. And I remember in conversations with experts, and I don't recall having particularly made reference to this GDPR rules in the European context, but they were saying that, for example, a soft law mechanism could complement existing regulatory rules like the GDPR example. So a bit sort of emphasizing what Nora was saying in her presentation, that soft law mechanisms can be a means to either do things upstream where regulation is not acting yet, or in the context of data to further enhance and strengthen good practices to protect data. And
unless Nora or Sana, if you'd like, do you want to jump into this question, or shall I move to the next one? We have one on artificial intelligence, I see.
I guess just one quick thing to mention from my perspective is that I think GDPR provides a good framework for protection of data and privacy. So you could characterize brain data as protected, like a protected characteristic, for instance, so that it is privy to extra legislation and protection. But that's kind of only one part of the problem with brain data. A lot of the problems exist with how that data is interpreted, how it's captured. There aren't any standard frameworks for interpretation or interoperability with other data sets. So it's a much broader challenge, whereas GDPR will only look at one aspect of it, I suppose. And again, you'd have to categorize different types of what constitutes as brain data. So, you know, if you're talking about a person's sexual orientation, it is what it is, whereas brain data, there's different types of brain data that could be developed. So I think it's a much more nuanced and convoluted space, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And we do have a few more questions, and one of them is specifically on artificial intelligence, as you mentioned in your presentation, Sana, and as well Laura. These technologies can converse, so neurotechnologies with artificial intelligence, and we know that the European Union AI Act and the Council of Europe AI Convention are already in progress. So could these types of regulations, which address artificial intelligence, address some of the risks that we've been talking throughout this webinar?
So maybe I can jump in. Yeah, this is a good question, because I was presenting on human rights, but of course, human rights is just a broader issue. And then we look at specific regulation, which could be the GDPR, consumer protection regulation, product liability, cybersecurity. Okay, and also the AI Act and the European AI Convention. And yeah, it is interesting because both proposals do not mention neurotechnologies directly or brain-computer interfaces, but we have in the EU AI Act Article 5 of prohibited AI techniques, and there we have subliminal manipulation methods, for example. So we have a first maybe step in the right direction, but many questions may remain open. So what are these technologies? Maybe not all neurotechnologies would fall inside. So I think it's rather that there we need some more specific regulation maybe, or change the AI Act. And the same is true for the European AI Convention, also of the Council of Europe. There's also an article that the manipulative capacities of AI should be considered, but it is not specified how the human mind should be protected.
Sana, Laura, do you have a similar point of view, or do you disagree?
I leave it over to Sana, because as I said at the beginning, we have our OECD AI colleagues who have been picking up the issues around the AI regulation, and so far they're the two recommendations that we have at OECD in this field. We haven't explored actually the question, but I'm just typing it away as a point for future work. So I'm handing over to you, Sana.
Yeah, not a huge amount to add to what Nora said. I think there are some instances where things are mentioned, but it's not explicit. And I think I suppose I'll answer a question with a question, which is sometimes annoying, so apologies. But you know, I'd be interested in understanding where these kind of simultaneous acts contradict one another, because in a medical setting, you'd need to manipulate, and you might use machine learning algorithms to modify and manipulate in order to treat disease. And a very generic wording in an AI Act might actually contradict that. So I think looking at something that's really specific and comparing it to something that's really generic can actually be quite contradictory and confusing for people working in that space. So I think that's something that probably needs to be looked at and disentangled.
Mm-hmm. And we are getting near to the end of our webinars, to the end of our webinar and the presentation and discussion as well. You've touched upon many different aspects with regards to neurotechnologies and their governance. So I'll perhaps now ask for your final thoughts among all that we've talked, which was quite a lot of aspects. What are for you the key aspects that governments, international organizations, and civil society should discuss now before the development of neurotechnologies progresses further? So essentially, what should be discussed now while we still have time to influence the development of these technologies? And I'll perhaps start with you, Sana.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we talked about so many different things, really, and I think all of it is quite important. I guess two things jump to mind for me, in not in any particular order, and I think Laura will probably speak to one of them quite a lot anyway. One is around international coordination and I guess global technology governance, because the way the world works and the way the global market is positioned with the supply chains and access to technology means that you really need to look at it from a global perspective and viewpoint, because people can access technology elsewhere if they don't get it in their own country. So technology regulation in silos is not very helpful anyway. I guess another really important viewpoint is this kind of a dichotomy sometimes, which can be unhelpful in certain ways around the healthcare setting and the non-healthcare setting, because those lines are being blurred. And when you look at lifestyle and stress and anxiety and depression, it kind of bleeds into one another. And a lot of the products on the market that are being kind of provided to consumers in a consumer setting will actually, in some settings might be considered medical interventions. So I think there's a lot of gray area that I think really needs to be tackled as well to protect patients, what you would term a patient versus what you would term a consumer.
Laura, your final thoughts?
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks so much, Sana, for kicking this round of thinking off. Just to build on what you said, of course, the point of international collaboration is one that we've explored in the STA Outlook chapter that I made reference to. We believe that places like the Council of Europe, UNESCO, OECD can be places for governments to have those exchanges of best practices, to also discuss pitfalls and challenges with regards to the co-development and implementation of soft law. The OECD recommendations, one example of that. We've also, we believe, and we've been seeing that sort of good governance of emerging technology in general, and neurotechnology is a good case in point, needs to happen upstream. So an important action, I think, for governments is to explore adaptive and agile governance mechanisms upstream, and to see whether soft law or regulatory measures and when in the innovation cycle they are best placed. I think there's lots of work that needs to be happening in that space, and also just to maybe make reference to what Nora said in her presentation, and it really resonates with what we've been seeing in discussions around the OECD recommendation as well, is that there is this inflation of there are more and more tools and things being developed, but we also need to be ensuring that the actors are having the right measures in place to implement and use them. And therefore, the OECD recommendation is also remaining a so-called living instrument. And with the monitoring exercise, we will be seeing the relevance that adherents see with it, and they're always subject to also potential change. Over to you, Nora.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would just briefly add that I think, yeah, we need international collaboration, but also interdisciplinary, because I think with always these technological questions, for example, also in law, it's really, really important that there's a collaboration, and yeah, that each one informs the decision of the other. So I also think that in law, for example, or maybe also in society as a whole, it's important that we accept that the brain or the mind or the inner sphere of the person is not untouchable, as maybe we had long time understood it in law, at least, and that it is really now time to draw the red lines, just to say that, okay, there are possibility to access the brain to manipulate more efficiently than before, and it is important to, yeah, draw red lines and make it clear how responsible innovation could look like.
Well, thank you very much. These were all very interesting perspectives. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today, but I would like to thank our speakers for interesting presentations and discussion, as well as thank our audience members for taking part in the webinar and for their questions. If you'd like to know more about the America Europe Fund, our upcoming events, or watch recordings of past events, including this one, you can do so on our website, which is america-europefund.eu. So thank you very much for joining us today and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.